I'm in California where you used to live. And, I would say, gosh, there's actually a lot to this. One, I live in California. Two, I'm on city council, so I hear a lot of frustrations that residents have with multiple factors of a community. And right now, the number one thing is housing, right? Housing crisis, price of housing, cost of housing. And then you're seeing that kind of spread out into, I would say, a lot of states that are undersupplied, that are maybe more difficult to build. It's off-weighted right now, right? And whenever I talk about on social media, there's multiple things I hear, but one thing I hear over and over is Airbnb. This has been created because of Airbnb, right?
Yeah, that's funny.
So, one, do you know what the percentage of investors that own or the portion of Airbnb that make up the total residential landscape is? And two, how big of a factor do you think Airbnb plays into the cost of living being so high?
I am pretty sure. The last time I looked, it's around 1% of rental stock is Airbnb. It's either 1% of rental stock or 1% of the entire housing supply. But I think it's of the rental stock. It's very small. Now, the impact, I mean, sure, I would say that there are some places that are impacted more than ever, but the narrative is very anti-Airbnb, and no, I don't think that's the real issue. I think the hotels have really stoked that fire, though. That's for sure.
So let's maybe take it a step further now and go into single family, because when you go into single family, there's multiple factors that make up ownership now, right? You have primary residence, Airbnb, small percentage. Investors now, big investors are getting into single family. And what you're hearing from a lot of, at least on social media, is investors shouldn't be allowed to own single family.
Yeah.
Right? Outlaw. I think there's a bill floating around, or they're trying to do a bill in Congress that will make it so that hedge funds have to divest from single family assets in the next 10 years. So every year they got to let go of 10% of their holdings so that in 10 years, no investor owns single family residence, right? Is that a good idea?
I think it's kind of lip service. I mean, that's just like the tax code is written for real estate professionals. So to then like make laws that are very counterintuitive to that doesn't really make sense to me. I think the real solution would be to make it easier to build. Like, dude, I've built stuff in California. I lived here for 5 years. I miss it. Like, I don't live here anymore. I didn't move because of political reasons or anything like that. My family's in Texas. But I built an ADU in Los Angeles. I was like one of the first people to build like an accessory dwelling unit whenever they passed that law in like 2016, 2017. Dude, it was hard. Right. It was really, really hard. And there are a lot of times where I just almost gave up. And I'm like, it shouldn't be this hard to build. I've also built several houses out in Joshua Tree. That's another market where a lot of people are like, Airbnb's ruining this and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, the arguments against it are always so odd to me, because I'm like, well, I'm building this $800,000 house. So the people that are being quote unquote affected would never have really purchased that house to begin with. And I have less of an issue with kind of the way I do it because I'm building it for myself. But at the end of the day, no, I don't really think that's the problem. I just wish that it was easier to build in some of these markets like New York, which is probably not the best example, but San Francisco, California, LA. I wish it was easier to build here. I think that's the real problem.
Okay, so housing crisis, the solution is not government involvement. The solution would be scale back on some of the regulation and red tape and make it easier to build so that more product can go up faster so that we can actually add supply.
Well, I feel like this is a viral TikTok. Someone's going to react to this. They're like, cancel this guy. But yeah, overall, I mean, sure, I think some government intervention is probably fine. But ultimately, I would say if the government made it a lot easier to build in some of these markets, like LA specifically, it wouldn't be as much of a problem.
Right.
But it's really hard.
I mean, that's my view.
Yeah.
Like, I think, like, I'm not somebody who goes, there should be no government involvement in anything. Like, I think there's areas where it's actually important.
Sure.
But I've always taken the stance of the private market does it faster, does it cheaper, and ends up being a better experience for the consumer, in this case, the renter or purchaser, right? So let the market do it. Let
Totally.
the market solve this problem.
I would love to build more stuff, dude. If it made sense, like if it wasn't such a bear to build more stuff out here,
Oh, it's a pain in the butt.
I would do it.
Yeah.
I really would. And then like there's just so many people. I don't know, man. It's weird being. I'm not really on that TikTok as much. I know you are, but those comments, I'm always like, guys,
TikTok is
this
wild.
is not how it works. But like Instagram, YouTube, they're like, you're rude. Why don't you build affordable housing? And I'm always like, why don't you?
Right.
If you're so mad about it, like I'm like, I kind of feel like the mom and pop sort of like. And I'm gradually moving out of that, so I'm not going to pretend like I'm that anymore. I mean, I don't have that many. I have like 40 units. I don't know. Whatever you want to consider that. A lot of people would say it's a lot, but I really don't think it's that many. I mean, I don't think that's really the problem. I could see the argument for institutional investors, but I don't know. I think the thing that I always come back to is that renters always still need a place to live, so I don't see why it's such an issue.
Yeah.
I mean, I know the arguments for it. I get it, but like I'm like, there's always a need for rentals.
Yeah, I agree. I think they go hand in hand, right? Like the owning a home has always been, and I think it still is, the American dream. I think like owning a house is still very desirable for even the younger generation.
Big time.
Right? But you definitely are seeing in this time where inflation is running out and interest rates are high in comparison to the price of real estate. Like this is a time where it feels hard to do anything, right? And you're starting to see, I think, the younger generation that hasn't been through corrections yet and entering the time going, I'm never going to own this.
Yeah.
I'm never going to own a home.
It's hard.
What do you say to them? Like, what should their outlook be? Is it possible? Will things get better?
Totally, man. Look, I don't think. Yeah, I think it's harder, especially for investors. If like you want to get into real estate, I would say it's harder. But at the end of the day, man, I still feel like ownership is very possible. Like if you're talking about what it costs to get into a property, FHA, first like primary residence loan, you're talking like 3 to 3.5%. That's a very small amount on a $200,000 house, $8,000, something like that. I mean, you're looking at like 7 to 15,000. And granted, I'm not going to say that's not nothing, but I do think that someone who's very serious about ownership, they could save that amount up. There will be a lot of people that listen to this and they're like, you must not live in California. I know the houses here are expensive.
Yeah.
It's harder in some markets.
Yeah.
It really is. So either you got to figure out how to make more money, which I know is easier said than done. And maybe living in Los Angeles or New York or San Francisco or some of these cities where you really want to, maybe that's just not the place where you're going to own the home.
Right.
It's a harsh reality, but it's true. And it's like you might have to just go find a more affordable market.
Okay, so for you were making decent money with, you were at Vandermedia,
Yeah,
correct?
yeah. When I first moved to LA.
Do you mind saying how much you were making?
No, not at all. I was making $80,000.
$80,000 a year.
Yeah.
There. Were you investing or were you building your own real estate yet?
Let's see. At that point, yeah, I bought my first house.
Okay. So where I'm trying to get is you lived in California. You were making, like, this is the hard part. In other markets, making $100,000 a year is like pretty freaking good.
Yeah.
In LA, it feels like you're scraping by,
Dude,
right?
yes.
How were you able to buy real estate and then build real estate on that income in such an expensive state?
So at that time we were dinks, double income, no kids, right? So my wife was also making $65,000. She was a teacher, and honestly, she did okay. I think teachers they do okay in LA. I mean, it's still like not enough, right? Teachers are everything, but us together, I think we were doing like 140, something like that. So the reason we were able to do it, though, very important distinction, is because we actually moved from Kansas City. I bought a house in Kansas City for $159,000. I sold a guitar amp, and I got a tax return for like, I don't know, $3,000 or $4,000, and I had enough money to put down. Why I got approved for this loan, I have no idea. Hashtag The Big Short. But they approved me for the loan. My wife and I bought it, and we lived in that house for 3 years. And then we were really broke, dude. Like I was making 40 there, and she was also at that time, she was nannying, making $12 an hour, and then she got a job that was making 42. So we were making like 80 grand in Kansas City. We were really broke. We had student loans, credit card debt. It was not easy by any means, but we scraped it together. 3 years into it, we were like, hey, why don't we move somewhere? Why don't we change it up? We felt like we got everything we wanted out of the city in a really positive way. And we're like, where should we go? And we're like, how about LA? I don't know why. We were like, yeah, we're broke. Let's go to LA. But we did that. Somehow we doubled our salaries and made a lot more. And we sold our house. It had appreciated from 159K to 215K.
Dang.
So we had $40,000 in our pocket.
That's a lot for Kansas City.
It was, dude. It was crazy. And this was like 2015. So it wasn't even at the boom, right? And I remember I had $80,000, $60,000 in student debt, $20,000 in credit card debt. We're moving to LA. My wife was like, I was like, we got 40K. She was like, should we use that to pay down our student loans? And I was like, we should, but I don't want to, because if we pay down 40,000, we're still going to owe this, like, the same amount every month, $1,000. And I was like, that's not going to change our life. I was like, not immediately. The financially smart decision would have been, yeah, let's pay it down from 80 to 40. But my monthly note was still going to be the same. So I was like, let's just bank it and let's see how it goes. I moved into an apartment and I'm paying $1,850 a month for a 666 square foot apartment. I know. I was like, they could have said 665. They could have lied. I would have been fine with it. It was $1,800 plus $50 for pet rent. We had 2 dogs. We lied about only having one. And after living there for 6 months, I was like, dude, I cannot bear to pay a landlord $1,800 for a shoebox. And so I told my wife, I was like, hey, let's buy a house. And she's like, can we afford it? And I was like, definitely not. But I would rather be house poor than paying a landlord $1,800. Right. So we started looking around and we found a house that had a little 279 square foot studio under it. We still own that house today. It's $624,000. And again, we got approved for it. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, let's do it. And she's like, can we afford it? I was like, we've got the studio. I think there's this website. You can list your rooms or your like spaces on there, and strangers will pay you money to like stay there every night. And it was obviously Airbnb. It was so new to us. And she was like, do you think it'll work? I was like, I think so. Let's see how it goes.
Dang.
And so we bought this house. And what was really interesting about it was we put 3.5% down on $624,000. After a few seller credits and kind of allowances, we paid $18,000. So we actually
18,000 came out of your pocket to do it.
18,500.
Okay.
So we had the $40,000 banked from the first house that we had, and then we used half of that to buy this house. And I remember, dude, I was so scared to tell people because like it's so expensive. Like that number, when you come from Houston, Texas, and homes are like 200,000. Like I remember my family, my sister, my parents are like, how much? How did you buy it? How much was it? I was like, 624,000. They're like, I felt so dumb telling them that, right? And I remember going to work, and I remember telling my coworkers like, I'm closing on a house, and they're just like, oh, cool. And like you can just tell in the back of their head, they're like, we make more than you. How can you afford this? Like we can't afford it, kind of thing. But I just figured out that house hacking, subsidizing my mortgage with like, renting out spare rooms or spaces in my house. I had done that in Kansas City. And I was like, man, I think if I can pay $2,000 to $3,000 of my $4,000 mortgage, I think I can do this. And that's exactly how it worked out.
If you like this clip, please subscribe to the channel. And if you want to watch the entire hour-long interview, the link will be in the description. And make sure you're following the Life with Mikey podcast on Spotify and Apple.